All right, guys, I want to welcome everybody to our session today. It's 1 o'clock, so we're going to get rolling. This session is being recorded. If you guys during the session would keep your cameras off and your mics muted, probably make the system run a little bit easier. If you have a question, feel free to unmute and ask the question. Our sessions, our environmental science sessions, are going to be led by Ms. Rebecca Thrash. She teaches at ASFA. And I'm going to turn it over to her and let it go. I'll be on to answer questions over chat if you need me. And I'll also send the link to the recorded version of this. Thanks for being here today.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is week 1 review. Like I was introduced before, my name is Rebecca Thrash, and I will be going through the first 3 topics in Unit 1, which is Introduction to Ecosystems, a little bit about terrestrial biomes and aquatic biomes, and also the basic kind of math conversions that you're going to have to do with the metric system and scientific notation. All right, so let's get started. First, when we think about the overall course of environmental science, we're going to be asking a lot of questions about ecology and different levels of the biosphere and what types of environmental processes are happening within them. So it's really important to be able to understand what level that you are referencing within a certain environmental problem. So for instance, the most basic level of organization within ecology is the organism itself. So we're looking at aspects that affect survival and reproduction. And so that's the basic unit of natural selection. And then you step up then to the population level. That's the unit of evolution. I'll get to a little bit more about population dynamics in a minute. Then at the next level of organization, you have all of the populations that are present in a certain area. And in environmental science, we're really interested in what the interactions are among the different populations of community and how certain environmental problems may change the way a community interacts. The next level is the ecosystem level, and that's when we take all of those community interactions and we also consider what's happening abiotically. So what's going on with energy transfer and the cycling of nutrients and biogeochemical cycles. So the largest level of organization is the entire biosphere. So this is every living thing on the globe, considering how global processes like climate and seasons and things like that may be affecting them. So let's kind of dive into some of those more specific levels of organization. And the first one are populations. So remember that a population is a group of organisms that are in a given area at the same time. Now these must be the same species, meaning that they can interbreed and make viable offspring together. So some things that we consider within population dynamics is the size of the population and their distribution and location. These can change with the time of year, meaning seasonal changes, or the time of day even. So some populations may be more active during the nighttime rather than the daytime. So when we look at the density and the dispersion of populations, we want to look at how many organisms are present in the area at any given time, so high density versus low density, and then their dispersion pattern. So here I've got shown 3 different dispersion patterns: clumped, uniform, and random. And a lot about how a population and a species operates within their ecosystem is going to determine this distribution. So the example here for clumped are this school of fish. Right? So individuals of this population tend to be tightly clustered together in groups. This is different from, say, uniform distribution, where individuals have about equivalent amount of space between each one. And you often see this in populations that even have some kind of territoriality in their kind of species interactions, where each one has to have a certain amount of space in their territory. Then you've got random distribution, and we see this a lot with plants. And that's because the way that they spread in their environment can also be random. So we're thinking about seed dispersion and what affects that, and then places in the environment that are actually conducive to growth, which can be randomly dispersed. Therefore, their population has a random dispersion. So when we talk about what is causing population growth or population decline, so when and why, that's what we're talking about within population dynamics. And later on in the course, you are going to have a whole bunch of information about how that happens for, species in their environment as well as the human population. So that's a very important concept to keep in mind. Okay, so all those other levels of organization that I mentioned, communities, and then ecosystems, and now this idea of habitat, how are those all related to each other? So remember that a community is all populations within a given area and their interactions with each other. Well, so communities always are in an ecosystem that also has certain abiotic factors like the mean annual temperature, mean annual precipitation, soil nutrient, soil structure, light availability, all of those things. Well, so ecosystems themselves then can have very specific and numerous habitats. So I've got here shown sort of this distribution of elephant habitat. So for example, when we look here on these maps, this map is for the African elephant habitat, and then this is for the Asian elephant habitat. We have areas where elephants are found, and then those are lined up with the types of ecosystems, or you might remember them as biomes, right? So here, this species of elephant can be found in the savanna and grassland as well as forest. So even though this species, they have the same characteristics and are very similar, they can occupy different habitats in many different ecosystems. Okay, so on that biggest level, or the largest level of organization, we talked about the biosphere, all living things, right? And we really are interested in why are species found where they are, what affects their distribution and what affects their density. When we think about those things, we also have to consider other parts of the Earth that have kind of their own global processes that affect the biosphere. So this involves talking about layers of the atmosphere, which again, you'll get into more later on into the course. But two of the most important layers of the atmosphere is the troposphere, which is where we are right now. It's the lowest level. This is where most of the planet's air is found. And then the stratosphere, which is the layer above that. Those are going to be really important things to reference when we start talking about air pollution and overall climate patterns later in the course. So other parts of Earth's structure that are notable here is the hydrosphere. That's just all water, so that includes saltwater and freshwater biomes. The lithosphere, that's where we have soil. That's where our mineral deposits are that we mine. This is where we extract fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. And so when you guys start talking about energy resources, the lithosphere is going to be a really important layer to remember the characteristics about. Also, you've got the mantle and you've got the core. This will come up when we start talking about geological processes, so tectonic plate movement, the amount of volcanic activity that happens in certain parts of the Earth, and those sort of general Earth processes. The main point I want to make about this is that it's extremely important to start using these very specific terms when you are talking about anything in this course. So when you are writing a free response question, or you are discussing anything that's happening within a certain place on Earth, it's good to go ahead and practice using these particular terms. So when you talk about air pollution, we're talking about tropospheric air pollution. When you talk about ozone depletion, we're talking about stratospheric ozone, right? So that's just kind of a good little tip that will help you be more accurate and precise when you start writing your free responses. Okay, so kind of moving on to some more global aspects that tend to affect even the sort of smallest interactions within ecology is seasonal shifts. And this happens because, of course, Earth has a tilted axis, and throughout the year, parts of the globe are more or less exposed to the sun. So because we're sort of like at this mid-latitude here, we experience, our spring and our summer during certain parts of the year, and then our fall and our winter. Why this is important for environmental science and ecology in general is that these seasonal shifts by latitude determine a lot of the larger ecological patterns that we see. So if you guys have any like hummingbird feeders at home, or like, your parents are maybe into that, you should kind of be noticing that a lot of hummingbirds are coming to the feeders right now. And that's because they are now in their migratory route. So because of the seasonal shift, some species have these really complicated and like seasonal and yearly migratory patterns that determine, where do they breed, how long they breed, and then where do they spend their time for the winter. Also, other things that are important with seasonal shifts are productivity. So later on in this unit, when you talk about primary productivity and trophic structures, when plants are most productive is, when it's warm and you've got a lot of water. And so those things can change with a change in seasons. Okay, so another thing to kind of remember about the change in season and how that's related to light intensity in a global pattern. So at the equator, no matter what time of year it is, the most intense light is hitting that part of the Earth all the time. And this is going to be important in a little bit when we start talking about the distribution of biomes. The more north you go, or the more south you go, the more likely the sun is going to be at an angle, and this is going to cause sunlight to be more dispersed and the intensity to be less. So when we think about what in ecology is important about sunlight availability or light availability, again, we're talking about productivity. So some of the more productive terrestrial biomes are going to be found around these latitudes, and then you're going to see some pretty serious seasonal shifts in productivity at the poles. Okay, so all along I've sort of been referencing all of these different factors that are in the ecosystem and within community dynamics. So terms that are really good to use when discussing these is abiotic and biotic factors. So anything within an ecosystem that affects another thing, either it's living or it's not. So some of the important biotic factors that tend to change with density and distribution are things like predation and disease spread, which is kind of interesting because right now we're in a pandemic, and the parts of the world that have the hardest time sort of like maintaining and quarantining and stopping the spread are those of high density, right? The more individuals or the more organisms that you have in a smaller space, the more easy it is for a disease to spread. So that's a biotic factor. Abiotic factors also affect populations and communities, but these are things that are independent of population density. These are non-living components. So what is the air like? What's the light availability? How much precipitation happens in a certain area? What is the pH of the water, right? So when we're talking about abiotic factors, we're also talking about things that limit the size and distribution of a particular population. So another way that you can think about this is that each species or organism or population has a range of tolerance for a lot of these factors. So I've got the example here of an aquatic ecosystem. You've got a population of fish, and then the abiotic factor of temperature. So within the entire range, you've got this sort of optimal temperature where most of the organisms within the population are going to want to be. And then you've got these like outside, like kind of getting cooler temperatures here, getting warmer, where, yeah, the organism can still, live and maybe be okay, but it's not optimum. And then outside of that zone, you have intolerance. So this is like the lowest temperature that organisms of this species can be found. So when we talk about ecosystems and the interactions within them, we always have to remember that for any given species, there's going to be a range of tolerance. And this is going to be really important when we talk about water pH as well as dissolved oxygen. And we'll get to that here in just a minute. So, word you probably heard a lot, especially if you remember from maybe 9th grade biology, is niche, right? Or maybe niche. So what is a niche? What does that even mean? How is that different from other words like habitat or species role or something like that? So best definition that I have is just the functional position of an organism in its environment. So that includes a whole bunch of stuff. So where does this organism forage for food? Where does this organism reproduce? How does it reproduce? What are its interactions with others around? What is its position within the food chain? All of those things are what define the organism or the population's niche. So an example here that you probably have seen, maybe something similar, is for a bunch of different warbler species, little songbirds. And you can see here that they're kind of closely related. They're all warblers, and they are functioning at different, in the same tree, but they've got different places where they either nest or eat from or, sort of spend their time. So this would be this warbler's very specific niche. Another reason this will come up later is when you start talking about specific species roles. And so I've got this otter here in this picture that is a keystone species. Keystone species is an important species role in a community because it maintains the balance of the rest of the ecosystem. So kind of give you a little bit more information about this little otter. So part of its niche, its like foraging behavior, is to dive down, at the bottom of the seafloor and eat these urchins, right? So they grab them up off the floor, come back up and eat them. And if they are not there, if they were removed, or if their population changes drastically, these sea urchins will then proliferate and increase in their population, and they will eat all of the kelp, these long, big stalks of algae that are the basis of the entire ecosystem where this otter lives. So the niche of this otter is to sort of maintain the balance between urchin populations and the kelp so that the entire ecosystem can function. It's a really important thing to remember later, talking about species roles. So when we talk about a niche, that's just the where and the what they're doing, but there's also kind of like with the range of tolerance, there is the theoretical reach of a species niche. So like what could they possibly occupy? Where could they possibly be found? And then there's the ecological reality of where they actually are. So in this case, I've got two different species of barnacle here. And for the theoretical range of the niche, the fundamental niche, this species could be found at any of this height, right, of this little tidal area. And then this species here could be found here. But in reality, the presence of this barnacle species actually limits the extent of this barnacle species niche range. So this is one of those community interactions that can be a little different depending on what kind of ecosystem you're looking at. So speaking of some of these species interactions, again, this is probably a familiar topic if you remember from, again, 9th grade biology, but symbiotic interactions. And there's 3 that mostly are discussed or that you kind of have to know about for apes. So first I want to kind of address this idea of symbiosis, because when we use that, we always sort of default the idea that symbiosis is like a good for both partners interaction, but in this case, symbiotic really just means two species are interacting, okay? So if this symbiotic interaction is commensalism, that means that one species is receiving a benefit from the relationship, and the other species is neither helped nor harmed. They're unaffected, right? In mutualism, that's when both species are getting something good. Species A benefits and species B benefits. And in parasitism, this is kind of the easiest to remember. One species is getting something they want, but the other one is being harmed in the process. So I've got some examples here to kind of illustrate how this might work. And you may recognize some of this stuff. So here, this is a type of wasp. There's many different species that do this. But instead of like making a nest or something and laying their eggs, they actually use caterpillars as their place to deposit their eggs. And this isn't so great for the caterpillar, because once those caterpillars hatch, the like little baby wasp, the larvae, are going to eat the caterpillar, and the caterpillar will die. So obviously, one species is benefiting greatly while the other one is being significantly harmed. These are parasitic wasps, and they get the benefit of a nice little egg depositing site, and the caterpillar is harmed because it causes death. Now, this is a species of bromeliad. You probably have seen like these in like businesses or malls or something like that, but they're actually this type of plant that grows on other plants, and in this case, large trees in tropical areas. Now, the bromeliad is obviously getting something great here. It's getting a place to get sunlight, to get water, and a secure place to be. The tree, though, it's not really harmed by this, and it's not really helped. It's just sort of a neutral party. So this kind of interaction here is called commensalism. Now here, this is a little eel, and this red guy here is a cleaner shrimp. And if you can notice, it kind of looks like the eel's about to take a bite of this guy, but he's not. The cleaner shrimp is actually taking parasites or mucus or bacteria out of the eel's mouth and using it as a food source. And the eel is actually letting him do this because it is going to provide better health benefits for the eel. So there are several fish species that do this as well as other types of cleaner shrimp. And what's cool about this is some of these little shrimp guys will actually hang out in groups, and fish will come by and let them clean them off, and everybody benefits. So this would be mutualistic. So now there are other interactions that are not defined as any kind of real symbiotic relationship, and this is mostly when we look at competition between species. So this can either be with members of different species for the same resource, so interspecific, and in this case I've got a lion who is maybe fighting with some hyenas over the same kill or resource, so they both want the same thing, and so they're in active competition. Or this can be between members of the same species for the same resource. And a lot of the time, this can be for mates, as it is the case with this ram species here. So they are in active competition for mating females, right? So interspecific and intraspecific. So these types of competition will have different effects depending on what resource that they are competing over. So this kind of brings us to some of the reasons why we see organisms or populations occupy very specialized niches. These can kind of be easily confused terms and ideas. So we've got competitive exclusion and resource partitioning, because they're kind of connected together, but they are different things. So I want to sort of like lay out what the definition is and why they're really different. So let's start with competitive exclusion principle. This states that two species cannot occupy the exact same niche and then stably coexist. There will be one species that more efficiently uses the niche and will end up excluding the other. Now, resource partitioning is then the division of the niche by the species in order to avoid this competition. So resource partitioning can then emerge from competitive exclusion, but they're not the same thing. And now these resources can be spatially partitioned or in time, meaning maybe some are using it during the day and then the others at night, or maybe they actually move around. So how does this affect the coexistence of the two species? Well, with competitive exclusion, there is no support for the coexisting of two species for identical resources. But with resource partitioning, the entire point is to help species coexist and create less direct competition between them. So I've got some examples. In competitive exclusion, this is a pretty well-known little example here. You've got two paramecium species that we track their population density, so basically like how many of them are there, it's kind of like population growth, over time. So when we look at these growth curves separately, so if they're just by themselves, they're their own little population, you can see that their density kind of peaks around the same time. But if you combine them, so you put them in the exact same little culture tube or whatever, there is a clear winner and a clear loser as far as who was better able to efficiently use the resources in the tube. And this line shows which is the more efficient species, and this one shows which is not. So if you were to let this happen over many, many more days, it would be likely that this species would disappear altogether. Now, resource partitioning, this is sort of what I showed you guys with those warbler species. You've got all these different birds, very similar, but they're able to be in very specific places within the same tree. Well, this is the same kind of idea here with these different aquatic birds. So you've got some birds that more stay up towards the shore and don't really get near the water. You've got others that might be right there at the edge of the intertidal zone. Some that have a little bit longer legs and they stay here. Still some that could maybe dive and reach the bottom. And then others who obviously have, like from natural selection, some type of physical advantage in deeper water. So this helps to avoid obvious direct competition for maybe some of the same resources. Okay, I hope that kind of helps to distinguish the difference between those two concepts. They can kind of get a little conflated sometimes. Okay, so another type of interaction between species that isn't necessarily competition, but it's sort of like food chain based, and this is predator and prey interaction. So you've got one animal that has to eat another one to survive, and then the one that's being eaten has to evade or avoid the predator to survive. So you've got sort of competing interest here. I've got an example here of this wolf species that is preying on rabbits. And the important thing to sort of note about the cycle here is two things. So here, notice that the population number, so the number of organisms for the wolves, never exceeds the number of rabbits here on these peaks. And if you kind of remember about trophic levels, and we'll kind of get into it later on in the unit, there's really good reasons for that. So also the second thing that's important here is looking at the lag time between the boom and the bust. So here's sort of the relationship. As rabbits increase in the ecosystem, their population numbers go up. Wolves are able to find and eat more of these rabbits, and then their population goes up. But you can see that there's a slight lag between the boom in the prey and the boom in the wolves. So now, as the wolves' population has increased, they are, taking these rabbits out. They are hunting them down. They are eating them, and that's going to cause the prey species population to bust or to decrease. Well, now the wolves have sort of or they've like maxed out their resources, they've overeaten, and now there's no more rabbits, so their population is then going to decline. Well, it's kind of a cyclical thing. So now that you have less wolves, the rabbit population is able to rebound, and then on we go. Now, if you remember from biology, this should be similar to other types of negative feedback loops. And those are processes in nature that are there to maintain some type of like homeostasis or equilibrium. And if you were to look at this over time, you would see that this is maintaining the population numbers of both species to be, about the same amount. Okay, so really kind of quickly, I want to hit the high notes of the other two unit topics, which are terrestrial biomes and aquatic biomes. I didn't really want to have to go through each and every single one, although it will be important for you to be able to identify soil differences between the biomes and other types of like primary productivity differences. But I'm going to talk about the most important aspects of the distribution of biomes, like why are they found where they are found. So the first thing that I want to show and kind of talk about is the effect of latitude. So here is the equator here, and then you've got the Tropic of Cancer here, and Tropic of Capricorn here. So like I said previously, the equator is going to get the most amount of sun all year long. And if you notice what types of biomes are found at this area, you've got tropical forest, and you've got tropical grasslands, and then deserts, which can be also tropical. The farther up you go, or as you go south in latitude, you'll start to see a shift to temperate forest, temperate grasslands, temperate deserts like we have in the United States. And then the farther north you go, you're going to end up with those like coniferous or boreal forests that have evolved to withstand lower temperatures and lower amounts of precipitation. And then you've got this really interesting little biome here, chaparral, and that is important now because we've seen there's been a lot of wildfires in certain aspects of, or in certain places in the world, and these biomes particularly are prone to fire and actually have to be maintained by periodic fires. So two abiotic factors that are really important in determining the distribution of these biomes, like where they are found, are going to be temperature and precipitation. And this will also be really important when you start to talk about climate later on in the course. Annual or temperature and precipitation patterns over really long time spans, that's what define climate. And climate is really what's going to determine the location of a biome. So this is sort of showing you those kind of like ranges here. So let's start here where you've got really, really high temperatures and a lot of precipitation. Where those two biotic factors happen, you're going to get things like rainforest. Lots of biodiversity, lots of different species, really complex food chains, all that kind of stuff. If you keep it the same temperature, but you decrease the precipitation, that is going to change also your different types of plant life and productivity. So here, as we decrease in precipitation, we no longer have like this evergreen rainforest. It's actually going to become a seasonal forest where you've got like a wet and a dry season. And this is going to mirror some of like our deciduous forest patterns as well. Then you transition into tropical scrubland and tropical savanna, all the way out to a tropical desert. So let's keep the precipitation, but let's decrease in temperature. So same amount of moisture, but now the temperature is different, or there's a seasonal change. Well, now we've got deciduous forest where a lot of these trees are going to lose their leaves and stay dormant over the winter and wait till there's more precipitation, like our forest that we have in the United States. You keep decreasing your temperature. Now we're getting into the coniferous forest, and then at the most extreme, the tundra. So I hope this kind of helps to illustrate the relationship between these two really important abiotic factors. So let's talk a little bit about aquatic biomes and the most important parts of it. So number one, we have to think about aquatic biomes as three-dimensional, right? Because you've got different layers of water and there's all kinds of things happening within it. You've got the zone at the top where photosynthesis is happening because you've got a lot of sunlight. You've got the benthic area where there's a lot of decomposition. There are currents that are turning over and bringing nutrients up from the bottom and oxygen from the top, and there's all these different trophic levels within. But one of the most important things about an aquatic biome is the amount of dissolved oxygen. And this will be important later on when you start talking about water pollution and water quality. So I want to say the least amount of dissolved oxygen where there still can be like robust aquatic life is about 5 parts per million. And so the most diverse aquatic biomes are going to have the highest amount of dissolved oxygen. And that makes sense if you think about how many organisms are in one space and how much oxygen they are demanding for their own cellular respiration. So abiotic factors that are super important for aquatic biomes: sunlight for photosynthesis. This is especially important for coral reefs. The availability of carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, nitrogen with nitrates, and phosphorus with phosphates. And later on, when again you talk about like agriculture and environmental issues that are related to agriculture, dumping a bunch of nitrogen and a bunch of phosphorus in aquatic systems are never a good thing. The other two factors that are important are salinity and temperature. And a lot of the time, salinity is going to determine other major aspects of the biome. So this is basically saltwater biomes versus our freshwater biomes. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit and shift from talking about some of the content to some of the skills and science practices that you have to know. And one of the big ones for apes is being able to work with really small numbers or really big numbers. And that is going to involve a lot of metric conversions and you to be really proficient at knowing this. So if you've taken like maybe AP Chem or AP Bio or something like that, we get that nice little formula sheet. Well, we don't have one for apes. So this stuff really just has to be remembered. So fortunately for us, there is sort of a range within the metric system that we tend to stay. So the largest numbers really that we have to deal with are in mega, and that's usually in terms of energy. So like megawatts with power plants and things. And then maybe the smallest might be micro, but really it stays around, like centi and milli and that kind of thing. So just, this is a quick reference to kind of show you what each one of those things, this is like our base unit. So you can think of like a meter or a liter or something like that, or a watt. And then this shows you the shift, either getting smaller or getting larger. So this is 1 times 10 to the 6. That just means that there's 1 followed by 6 zeros. And that's a million. Okay, so a little bit about working with scientific notation. Hopefully this is just review, but it's pretty simple and it doesn't get really much more complex than this. So you've got scientific notation, which is showing you like the base 10 here and then the exponent, and then you've got standard notation. So the other reason why this is important is because like used to, you couldn't even use a calculator, but they let you use calculators now. And it really cuts down on the time that you have to like punch in all these numbers and deal with these really, really large numbers, and you can simplify them in scientific notation. So this number here, that's what it looks like in standard notation. You would just move to the right. And then if you wanted to look at this, the standard notation for this really tiny number, you would move to the left. Okay. So quick review on how you do operations with scientific notation. So if you are adding or subtracting terms that are in scientific notation, It's kind of like with fractions, right? You just have to have the power of 10 in each term equal to each other. So say this was a 3, or like maybe this was a 5 or something like that. You would just have to move the decimal until the exponent was the same, and then you just add the coefficients like you normally would, and you keep the exponent. For multiplication, you don't have to manipulate the coefficients at all. You simply multiply the coefficients, and then you add the exponents. So in this case, 2 times 3 is 6, and then 4 plus 2 is 6. So with division, it's the opposite. You are going to subtract the exponents and then still divide the coefficients. So here, 8 times 10 to the 7 divided by 2 times 10 to the 4. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 7 minus 4 is 3. So that's how you get that. Let me kind of check in with you guys. Is this good? Is this more like review for you guys? Any questions before we move on? All right. So let's get into some questions and sort of look at what types of questions you might see on the exam or like a unit exam. So question 1, traveling southward from the Arctic regions of Canada to the tropics of Panama, one passes through several biomes: tundra, coniferous forest, temperate deciduous forest, and tropical rainforest. This pattern of change in vegetation is primarily the result of, so let's look at our answer choices. A, primary and secondary succession. B, an increase in mean annual temperature and a decrease in mean annual precipitation. C, an increase in both mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation. Or D, an increase in the total annual hours of sunlight. So if we remember what we talked about previously with the seasonal changes according to latitude, and why that then causes there to be higher than average, or higher temperatures towards the equator and then decreasing as you move out, we can sort of eliminate D here. So that isn't exactly what's going on here. It's more the biotic factors that are determined by sunlight. So an increase in both mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation are some of the biggest factors that determine the increase in vegetation as you move towards the equator. All right, question 2. Which of the following best illustrates an abiotic component of the environment affecting a biotic component of the environment? So just to be clear, we're talking about something that is non-living and density independent. And here we're talking about things that are living and definitely density dependent. So A, coral reefs modify the direction of an ocean current. Low phosphorus content in soil limits the growth of vegetation. Plants release O2 into the atmosphere during photosynthesis. A thick planting of ground cover reduces soil erosion on a hillside. So we're looking for abiotic affecting biotic. So A, coral reefs, that's definitely living. Direction of an ocean current, well, that's non-living, so that's the reverse. Now, low phosphorus content, that's a soil nutrient component, and that is abiotic. And limiting growth of vegetation would be biotic. So that fits what the question is asking. All right, question 3. The major biological source of dissolved oxygen in the ocean comes from decomposition of organic sediments on the ocean floor, metabolic processes of coral and reefs, oxidation of sulfur by bacteria in ocean vent communities, and then photosynthesis by phytoplankton. So let's check out A first. So decomposition would actually be increasing the demand for oxygen, because this is basically cellular respiration. You've got decomposers that are breaking down dead and organic sediments. So that would use oxygen, definitely not increase oxygen in the water. Again, metabolic processes of coral. Coral is an animal that would use oxygen, not make oxygen. Oxidizing sulfur, like you literally are using oxygen in that reaction. So the last thing is the correct answer, which is photosynthesis. And we know that oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthetic processes. So let's look at some of those symbiotic relationships and see if we can mix and match appropriately. So we've got all those different community interactions we talked about previously. So which one of these is exemplified by bees consuming nectar and carrying pollen from one flower to another? So who's benefiting here? Obviously, the bees are benefiting because they're getting a food source. But is the plant benefited, harmed, or are they a neutral party? Well, if they have their pollen carried from one flower to another, that's going to help in their own reproduction. So that's a positive for the plant. So both of these organisms are benefiting, so that is mutualism. So which of these is exemplified by moss growing on a tree trunk in a forest? Well, the moss is obviously getting something great because it gets a habitat, it gets a place to live. But there's really nothing there telling us that the tree is harmed by this or helped. So that's a neutral for it, and that is commensalism. So starlings displacing bluebirds from nesting sites. Starlings are actually an invasive species in America. They're those, they look black, but they've got these little iridescent wings. So if they are displacing bluebirds from where they normally would nest, it sounds like the starlings are getting something good. They're getting space to nest, but the bluebirds are losing out, right? But is this parasitism, or is this just competition from the same resource, which is nesting sites? That is competition. So ticks feeding on a deer. Now the tick is getting some food, so that's a positive, but the deer is, losing its own blood. It's being exposed to possible disease that the tick could be carrying. So that is a negative thing. So that would definitely be parasitism. All right, last multiple choice question here. The location of the greatest remaining natural biodiversity. So biodiversity is just a lot of different species living together in the same location. And if we remember talking about the abiotic factors that tend to affect this, high temperatures throughout the years, lots of precipitation so that you've got lots of primary productivity and a lot of energy in the system for multiple different species to be able to utilize. So if we look at the places on this map, we've got A, this little patch here, B, this coastal region, C, right here, and D, this is sort of north of where we are. And then the last one is E. So the one that's sort of closest to the equator is E, but let's kind of make sure that's all we're considering. So we're talking about the greatest remaining natural biodiversity. This area here is highly populated by people. So we've probably cut down a good bit of the trees, or we've got a lot of urbanization and stuff like that. Same thing probably here and here. Also, if you kind of remember, this is where you have desert. So if you were thinking E, the Amazon rainforest, you are correct. All right, so last thing we're going to do together is a free response question, and this is where we're going to apply that the metric conversions and scientific notations to solve this problem. So before I go through this, I do want to say, I know that sometimes these problems can be a little intimidating because they give you a lot of numbers, they give you a lot of information up front, and then you kind of have to manipulate it. But a lot of people, when they take the ACE exam, they tend to just skip this altogether. So this is a really great place on the exam to get points that other students are not getting. So please, please, please do attempt the math. And you can get really good at it if you just kind of do a little bit of practice like we're about to do. So this problem is about an offshore wind farm project, and it's going to be using turbines to generate electricity, and it's going to be built along the Atlantic coast of the United States. So this farm will be about 13 kilometers from the coast in water with an average depth of 10 meters. The project will have 200 wind turbines, each with a capacity of 4 megawatts. All that means is that's the amount of energy that each of those turbines can create, 4 megawatts. And each turbine is going to cost $1.2 million to build. So the area that's going to be served by the project, the electrical demand is expected to be 2 times 10 to the 6 megawatt hours per year. So I've sort of highlighted some of the most important parts about this passage. And if you want to kind of do that same strategy, like maybe circle or underline or highlight or something, that'll kind of help you pull the important numbers that you'll need to do your calculations. So let's see what they want us to do. Calculate how much electricity in megawatt hours the wind project needs to generate per year in order to provide 80% of the annual electrical demand in the service area. So they want you to show all work. So reason why is because they're going to give you 2 points for this. 1, for showing your setup, so showing that you know how to solve the problem, and then 1 point for the correct answer. So that's why I'm telling you guys to please attempt the math. Oftentimes, they will give you a point just for showing that you could have known how to do it. All right, so how are we going to approach this problem? First step is determine where you're starting from. Okay? We're going to start from 80% here because we need to know how much generation is required for only 80% of the annual electrical demand. And then the second step is to determine where you're ending up. We have to end up with electricity in megawatt hours. So that's a good way to kind of check your calculations. So 80% of the annual electrical demand, let's start with that, 0.8 in little parentheses. So the annual electrical demand of the service area, we know from the passage. Electrical demand in the area to be served by the project is expected to be 2.0 times 10 to the 6 megawatt hours per year. So all we've got to know is what 80% of that is. So I'm going to multiply 2 times 10 to the 6 megawatt hours by 0.8. There's no exponents here that I have to deal with, so I'm really just taking 80% of this number. And that's going to give me 1.6 times 10 to the 6 megawatt hours. Okay. Now, we've got to remember this term because usually these problems sort of build on themselves. So what's the next question they want us to do? Customers in the service area pay 20 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity. That's sort of their rate from the power company. Calculate how much revenue will be produced if the wind turbines provide 80% of the annual electrical demand in the service area. Show all work. Well, now we already know what our starting place is going to be because we've already calculated what 80% of the annual electrical demand is going to be. And now we know our ending place. We've got to have a revenue number, so that's going to be a dollar amount. Now again, 2 points for this. 1 point for your correct setup and 1 point for the correct answer. So our starting place is that 80% number, which was 1.6 times 10 to the 6 megawatt hours, okay? But now we need to put in all of the rest of the information. So we know that customers in the service area pay this much for electricity, right? So we're going to put that into our calculation, but notice I'm converting this number to scientific notation to make my calculations easier, because now all I have to worry about is dealing with the coefficients and then, adding, subtracting, whatever I need to do with the exponents. So 2 times 10 to the negative 1 kilowatt hours. Now, these units here can't quite cancel out yet. I've got to convert kilowatt hours to megawatt hours so that they can cancel, and I can just be left with this revenue amount. So I do that by putting in this conversion factor. I know that there are 1,000 kilowatt hours, or 1 times 10 to the third kilowatt hours, in 1 megawatt hour. Well, now my megawatt hours can cancel, and and my kilowatt hours can cancel, and I'm left with the revenue amount, which is where I'm trying to go. So that leads us to 3.2 times 10 to the 8. So, you know, you've got 1.6 times 2 times 1, and then you just add your exponents. So 6 minus 1 is 5, plus 3 is 8. So that's where we get. And 16 times 2, 32, 3.2. Now they also would have taken just the full, you know, standard expression here amount, or you could have said $320 million, because they tell you million here in the passage as well. So all 3 forms are acceptable. Okay, last little bit here. Assuming all turbines are operating, so all 200 wind turbines, calculate how many hours the wind turbines must operate to provide 80% of the annual electrical demand in service area. Show all work. So I think you guys know where we're going here. 80%, we've already calculated. Now we just need to know how many hours the wind turbines must operate. So I'm starting out with my 1.6 times 10 to the 6 megawatt hours, because that's the demand. Now I know how many turbines there are. I also know how many, like the capacity of each one, which is 4 megawatts. So I'm going to put that information in. I've got 4 megawatts per turbine. I've got 2 times 10 to the 2 turbines. That's a tongue twister. Right here, because that's how much energy, or that's how many turbines that I have in the entire wind farm. And then that gives me 2 times 10 to the third hours, or 2,000 hours. So that's how long the wind turbines have to operate in order to provide 80% of the electrical demand of the service area, or annual service area. So some important things to kind of check out here. Here, the megawatts are what's canceling out, and that's why I'm left with the hours here. Okay, so that's sort of a quick review of the first kind of week in APES. I hope that helped you guys out. And are there any questions?